A team of archaeologists at the University of Oregon have found one of North America's oldest human-occupied sites in southern Oregon.
In our first 2 forays out here, we found that 15,800-year-old ash, and underneath that we found camel tooth fragments.
A team of archaeologists dug into the floor of a cave in southern Oregon and uncovered something that had no place in the accepted story of human history. They sent it to the lab. The results came back impossible. They tested it again using a different machine. The answer was the same. They ran a third test. Once again, the results didn't change. Whoever left this behind had been standing on American soil thousands of years before conventional science says the first humans ever arrived. What archaeologists uncovered next didn't just challenge the timeline of human history in America. It suggested that the story the world had accepted for more than a century was wrong from the very beginning. Before we uncover what archaeologists found next, make sure you're subscribed, because the discoveries on this channel only get more unbelievable from here. The Oregon Cave. Stay in that cave with me for a second. It is called the Paisley Caves, a row of dry rock shelters in south-central Oregon. And here is the part nobody likes to admit. Researchers had known about the place for decades. They just never dug deep enough, never looked closely enough. Everyone assumed the answer to the question of the first Americans was already settled, printed, framed, and hanging on the wall. So, why bother going down another layer in a dusty cave in the middle of nowhere? And when a University of Oregon team finally went down through the layers of the cave floor, what they pulled out was not a spear point. It was not a tool. It was preserved human waste, dried and hardened, sitting exactly where a person left it thousands of years ago. I know how that sounds. A find that humble does not make the evening news, and it does not get its own museum hall. But the dry desert air of the high Oregon Plateau had done something no lab on Earth can do. It kept that fragile organic thing intact, century after century, while everything else that ever lived in that cave rotted away to nothing. And locked inside it was something a stone tool can never give you. Not a shape, not a guess. Human DNA. They sequenced the mitochondrial DNA, and the result left no wiggle room. It matched the Native American founding haplogroups A2 and B2. Not some failed migration that wandered in and died out. The direct ancestors of indigenous people alive in America right now. People with names, with families, with a bloodline running straight back into the dirt of a cave most of the world has never heard of. Sit with that for a second, because it is the part that changes the stakes. This was not a curiosity in a glass case. It was proof, in living genetic code, that the oldest chapter of the American story never ended. That line is still here. The people who sheltered in that cave were not a dead end, not a doomed group that arrived too early and vanished without a trace. Their descendants survived the Ice Age, survived the melting of the glaciers, survived thousands of years of upheaval, and they are walking around today. And the proof of the oldest known chapter of human life on this continent was not a temple or a golden artifact. It was the most ordinary thing a body leaves behind, dried out on a cave floor, hiding in the one kind of evidence no archaeologist ever puts on a poster. Then they dated it. The method was accelerator mass spectrometry, which measures the age of the organic material itself, not the dirt around it. That distinction matters more than it sounds, because the usual objection to an impossibly old find is that the object slid down from a younger layer, or the dirt got mixed, or the sample was contaminated. This method cuts straight past all of that. It dates the thing in your hand on its own terms. Calibrated, the result came back more than 14,000 years before the present. at least 1,000 years before the Clovis people were supposed to have arrived at all. You have to understand what that breaks. For most of the 20th century, every textbook taught the same tidy story. The first Americans were the Clovis people, named for the fluted spear points found at a site in New Mexico. Those distinctive blades, with a groove down the center, that made them lighter and deadlier. The story went that they walked over a frozen land bridge from Asia around 13,000 years ago, slipped south through a gap in the ice, and spread out across an empty continent. First to arrive, nothing before them. It was simple, it was easy to teach, and it was wrong. Careers were built around it. Entire museum exhibits were designed around it, with the Clovis hunters proudly leading the story of the first people on this land. To challenge that date was not just about questioning a number. It meant telling many respected experts that the story they had defended their whole lives was nothing more than a myth. Oregon had just revealed a gap of 1,000 years between Clovis and the real story. The Clovis people were not the first. They were not even anywhere near it. And Oregon was not finished. One date from one cave was exactly the kind of evidence the old guard could dismiss as an accident, one strange result, contamination, bad testing, or simple chance. They had done that before, many times. But 70 miles from this cave, another Oregon site was about to take the Paisley date and push it into something much older and much harder to ignore. Not an accident this time, a pattern. And patterns are what destroy careers. If this story is already making you question everything, hit subscribe now, because what a University of Oregon archaeologist uncovered 70 miles away is even bigger. This is where the story stops being about a date and starts becoming about who these people really were. Rimrock Draw, 70 miles from the Paisley Caves near the town of Riley in Harney County, sits a place called Rimrock Draw Rock Shelter. Dr. Patrick O'Grady, a University of Oregon archaeologist, has been excavating there since 2011. If you have ever imagined archaeology as one dramatic discovery, this place is completely different. For years, the site revealed almost nothing. Just a few obsidian flakes and a groundstone tool resting near the front of the shelter. The kind of slow, knees-in-the-dirt, brush and screen work that never ends up in documentaries. Year after year, season after season, with no promise that any of it would ever lead to something important. Rimrock Draw did not reveal DNA. It revealed a timeline. Buried in the soil was a layer of white ash, and scientists connected it to a known eruption of Mount St. Helens, dated to around 15,400 to 15,600 years ago. That ash became the rule for the entire site. Anything discovered beneath it was older. Anything found above it was younger. There was no debating it, no mixing the layers around. A volcano 1,000 miles away had erupted, spread its ash across the land, and sealed a lid over history itself. Everything beneath that layer had remained untouched since before the ash ever settled. And this is exactly why Rimrock Draw matters so much alongside Paisley. The cave gave researchers a date and a strand of DNA, and skeptics could always whisper about contamination or a sample slipping through the layers. But a volcanic ash layer is not something you can argue against. It is a solid line carved through the earth by an event no one can recreate. Whatever lies beneath it is older than the eruption, without question. So, when the team began uncovering objects below that ash, they were not asking the lab to simply believe them. They were asking it to believe the volcano. And beneath that ancient layer, O'Grady's team began uncovering things that should never have been there. 27 tiny pieces of tooth enamel, carefully sifted from the soil one after another. One belonged to an ancient camel, an Ice Age species that once lived across North America and disappeared thousands of years ago. Another came from Bison antiquus, a bigger, heavier ancestor of today's American buffalo, also long extinct. These were not animals that had wandered through a few centuries ago. These were creatures from a lost world, the giant wildlife of the last ice age. And there they were, buried beneath the same ash, in the very ground where a human tool would soon be uncovered. The picture taking shape inside that trench was a world most people cannot even picture. Camels and massive bison crossing what is now Oregon's high desert, and somewhere among them, a human carrying a knife. Then the tool appeared, a piece of orange chalcedony, a shiny type of agate that reflects the light, shaped into one tool with a curved cutting edge, a flat scraping edge, and a serrated edge polished smooth. O'Grady described it as an early Swiss Army knife, one tool designed for many different tasks. And the detail that truly stays with you is the wear. The tiny teeth along that jagged edge had become polished, and that kind of shine does not appear in a week or even a month. It takes years of constant use. Someone carried this tool for a long time, sharpened it again, cut, scraped, sawed, and cut once more, until one day they left it inside that shelter and, for some unknown reason, never returned. You are not staring at a simple rock. You are seeing the treasured possession of someone who lived and died an unimaginably long time ago. A tool smoothed by the same everyday use that wears down a handle or a key today. That is the remarkable closeness of a place like Rimrock Draw. Across 20,000 years, you can still recognize one person's daily habits in the polished edge of a blade. Here is the part that changes everything. The tool rested about 10 centimeters below the camel teeth. Deeper means older. So, the tool was older than the animals, and when the lab tested those animal teeth, both the camel and bison dated back roughly 21,000 to 22,000 years. O'Grady did not believe it. He tested them again. The same time range appeared. 2 samples, 2 separate tests, 2 matching results. Imagine him sitting there with that second date in front of him. The one he had secretly hoped would prove the first result wrong. Instead, it did the exact opposite. It confirmed everything. He later admitted it was deeply unsettling to be holding material that old. You do not announce a discovery like that unless your evidence is rock solid, because you know exactly what happens to researchers who make that kind of mistake. He had seen it happen before. Now, he had 2 matching dates, and there was no escaping them. The animals at Rimrock Draw had died more than 18,000 years ago, and the worn knife buried beneath them showed that a person had been there even earlier. And that knife was not Clovis. It belonged to something known as the Western stem tradition. Long blades, narrow shoulders, rounded bases. It looked nothing like a Clovis point, and it existed thousands of years before the Clovis style appeared. That is the quiet bombshell hidden inside those dates. For decades, experts believed every ancient tool in the Americas had to come from Clovis, because Clovis was supposed to be the beginning, the first culture, the first hands to shape stone on this continent. But a tradition that looks completely different from Clovis and is older than Clovis could not have come from Clovis. It points to a different people, with their own skills, their own way of shaping stone, already living here. Different hands, different methods, an entirely separate route growing quietly beneath the official story. So, Oregon now had 2 sites, 2 methods, and one unbelievable message. But if people this ancient were living in Oregon, the question was no longer whether the textbook was wrong. It became how they reached this place, and just how far back the story really stretched, because the next clue did not come from Oregon. It came from a warning that had been echoing across the other side of the country for decades, and almost nobody paid attention. The first crack. Long before anyone excavated deep into Paisley, the first crack had already appeared inside a sandstone rock shelter in western Pennsylvania called Meadowcroft, beside a stream about 7 miles from the Ohio River. One archaeologist later described it as a place with everything a prehistoric traveler could want. Exactly the kind of safe, comfortable shelter where ancient people would have gladly spent the night without a second thought. In 1955, a local historian named Albert Miller reached into a groundhog burrow on the property and pulled out artifacts that simply should not have been there. One handful of dirt taken from an animal's tunnel became the first loose thread in the entire mystery. In 1973, a scientist named Jim Adovasio began excavating the shelter floor, removing it one careful layer at a time. And the deeper he dug, the older everything became. Layer after layer, signs of human activity continued reaching farther back than the textbooks claimed was possible. This was not a man trying to prove a strange idea. He was simply following the evidence in the ground, carefully recording everything he found. And the earth kept telling him exactly the same story, the deeper he looked. When the radiocarbon dates finally returned, humans had been living at Meadowcroft as early as 16,000 to 19,000 calibrated calendar years ago. Thousands of years before Clovis. In July 1980, Adovasio published the findings in American Antiquity and finally said what nobody wanted to hear. The Clovis first model was wrong, and his fellow researchers turned against him. Some claimed his samples had been contaminated. Others simply acted as though the paper had never been published, which, in science, is its own form of rejection. Imagine being the person holding the correct dates, while an entire field decides you must be the one who got it wrong. The resistance became so strong, so deeply personal, that researchers eventually gave it a name, Clovis primacy syndrome, describing its continued defense as outdated and ultimately hopeless. And it worked. That is the uncomfortable truth. Resistance like this is supposed to disappear as more evidence appears. But this one refused to let go. Even today, decades later, one survey of professional archaeologists found that only about 38% accepted Adovasio's dates. Another 38% remained uncertain. The rest still rejected them completely. Read those numbers once more. A discovery that has stood strong for more than 40 years still cannot convince even 1/3 of the field, not because the evidence is weak, but because accepting it means rewriting the careers and reputations of many of the people casting the votes. So, when Oregon's caves and Oregon's volcanic ash layer entered the picture, the field had already been divided for years. Adovasio had taken the criticism decades earlier, alone, on the opposite side of the country. Oregon became the evidence that made it impossible to keep ignoring the truth, the second voice proving the first had been right from the very beginning. And the moment you accept that the timeline is broken, an even bigger question appears. Because 700 miles south of Oregon, in a white desert almost nobody had bothered to explore, there were footprints, 61 of them, and the people who made them were never supposed to have existed. Ghost tracks in the White Sands. White Sands National Park is a vast stretch of bright gypsum dunes in southern New Mexico, so white and so silent it hardly seems like it belongs on Earth. In 2009, researchers crossing the dry bed of an ancient lake called Lake Otero noticed strange marks pressed into the gypsum. At first, nothing seemed extraordinary, just impressions left in the hard, pale ground. But the closer they examined them, the more obvious it became. Footprints, human footprints. And not just one or two, 61 of them. They were incredibly clear. You could see the toes. You could see the curve of each arch. Some were tiny, no bigger than a child's foot. Others belonged to adults moving quickly, almost running. This was not the distant evidence of a stone or a bone. This was a frozen moment. A group of people, children among them, walking along the edge of an Ice Age lake on an ordinary day, leaving footprints in soft mud that the sun later hardened before layers of sediment buried them, preserving them in darkness until someone finally walked across them again, thousands of years later. You are not simply reading about these people. You are standing where they once stepped. They were here, alive, caught in mid-stride, heading somewhere at a time when the textbook insists no human had even reached this continent. The first dates arrived in 2021 through radiocarbon testing on the seeds of a plant called spiral ditch grass, discovered within the same layers as the footprints. Between 21,000 and 23,000 years old. Skeptics immediately challenged the findings, and to be fair, they raised a valid concern. The seeds might have absorbed ancient carbon from groundwater, making them appear much older than they really were. That is exactly the kind of challenge strong science should be able to overcome. So, the team tested again, this time using conifer pollen, which does not absorb groundwater carbon and comes directly from trees that were alive at that time. The result stayed exactly the same, between 21,000 and 23,000 years. Then, in June 2025, a third study published in Science Advances approached the question from another direction, testing organic material from wetland mud and shallow lake sediments. 3 completely independent sources now: seeds, pollen, and mud, each examined separately. All 3 pointed to the same time period, the peak of the last Ice Age, exactly when the textbook insists North America had no human inhabitants. And those people were not by themselves. Their footprints appear beside the tracks of Columbian mammoths and giant ground sloths, enormous Ice Age animals that disappeared from the continent thousands of years ago, preserved within the very same ancient mud at the exact same moment. Humans and giant beasts, walking side by side, sharing a shoreline the textbook insisted no human had ever witnessed. This is what Oregon set into motion. 2 Oregon sites had already pushed the timeline further back, and once researchers were forced to take Oregon seriously, the rest of the discoveries stopped looking like isolated mistakes and started looking like a clear pattern. White sands now revealed entire families crossing the continent during the heart of the Ice Age, nowhere close to any frozen corridor, at a time when the old map claimed the entrance into America had not even existed yet. But White Sands reaches only about 23,000 years into the past. There is something in Southern California so much older that it makes White Sands seem surprisingly recent, and nobody was even searching for it. They were building a freeway. The Freeway Dig. A freeway construction crew in Southern California was cutting through the ground when a bulldozer blade struck bone. Work came to an immediate stop. Nobody had been searching for anything. There were no archaeologists at the site, no research project, no planned excavation. Just workers, heavy machines, and a highway waiting to be built. The foreman walked over to a curved object sticking out of the dirt that was clearly neither rock nor pipe. It was the unmistakable shape of something that had once been alive. Paleontologists were called in, and what they carefully uncovered were the partial remains of a single mastodon, an elephant-like animal that disappeared at the end of the Ice Age. But the bones had not simply fallen there and fossilized untouched. As the team slowly brushed away the dirt, piece by piece, an uneasy feeling spread among everyone standing around the pit. They were not looking at an ordinary fossil. They were looking at a scene. Someone had done something to those bones, intentionally. The mastodon bones showed spiral fractures, the kind of damage that only forms in fresh bone. This is the detail that transforms a fossil into a crime scene. Old fossilized bone becomes dry and brittle, and when it breaks, it shatters apart. Fresh bone, bone that still holds moisture, twists and spirals as it snaps. Someone had broken these bones apart while they were still fresh, almost certainly to reach the marrow inside, the rich, fatty food prehistoric people valued so highly. This was not scavenging or simple chance. This was butchery, a well-known technique carried out by someone who understood exactly how to get every bit of value from a carcass. Scattered among the bones were 5 large cobbles, fist-sized stones much too heavy to have been carried there by water. Geologists checked. Water had not placed them there. People had. Hammerstones and anvils carried to the site, used to crack the bones open, then abandoned in the dirt, when whoever used them simply walked away and never returned. Here is the number that leaves the room completely silent. The bone was dated using uranium-thorium analysis, and every single test produced the same result, around 130,700 years old. Read it again, because it does not belong in the same story as everything you have heard so far. 130,700 years. To understand the scale, the oldest discovery we have discussed until now, aside from the Cerutti bones, was around 23,000 years old. This is more than 5 times older than that. It is older than our own species and is widely believed to have spread beyond Africa. It is a number so far beyond the accepted timeline that for years the easiest response was to assume it had to be wrong. In 2017, Nature published the findings. The authors, Stephen Holen, Kathleen Holen, Thomas Demarais, and Richard Fulligar, presented them in the most careful, cautious, and technical language they could manage, and the paper still exploded across the field. Some kind of human species had been living in North America 130,700 years ago. Not modern humans, not Neanderthals, but something the current models cannot even identify. Most researchers simply avoid discussing the site, not because they have disproved the evidence, but because it is too controversial, too difficult to explain, and too damaging to too many careers to seriously confront. It is simply easier to look away. So, the question remains unanswered, the way uncomfortable questions in science often do. Who broke those bones apart? Nobody knows. Nobody can even make a confident guess. It was not a modern human, because modern humans were never supposed to be anywhere near the Americas that early. It was not a Neanderthal. It was some other branch of the human family living in California more than 100,000 years before the story was ever supposed to begin, doing something as personal and unmistakably human as breaking open a bone to reach the marrow inside. But it places Oregon's discovery inside a much larger and far stranger picture. If Oregon proved people were here long before Clovis, California quietly suggests that someone, or something, was here 100,000 years before even that, bringing us right back to the question Oregon could never answer alone. How did any of them get here? Because the old explanation, the single frozen passage from Siberia, is beginning to fall apart. If this surprised you as much as it surprised us, hit subscribe, leave a like, and click the next video on your screen, because the next major discovery is already being uncovered. And when it finally comes to light, we'll be here to walk you through exactly what they found.